I think we all have a fairly hazy idea about what ethics is, and we believe intrinsically that ethics is a good thing. My knowledge of the topic is incredibly limited, so I'd like to introduce my colleague, Professor Doug Baker, who knows way more about ethics than I do. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Peter. A pleasure to be here.
So, Doug, I don't have a crisp sense of what ethics is. When I hear the word ethics, I think of all kinds of things: right and wrong, good and evil, morals, values, behaviors. Can you untangle some of these things for me?
Yes. I think, Peter, what I like when I teach ethics, I like to first start off with teaching what ethics is not.
Okay.
Start off in the negative. Usually that's not a good thing, but I'll start off in the negative. What it is not is it is not values. It is not religion.
Mm-hmm.
It is something fundamentally that underlies all of society. It underlies all of religion, and it transcends culture.
So all societies, all religions, all cultures.
Yep.
It's a global thing.
It's global. It is actually the philosophy of morality, and it offers us a guide. Ethics offers us a guide as to the right thing to do.
Okay.
And so values are a constellation of beliefs, an amalgam of who we are, and it's culturally specific values, and it's contextually specific. In other words, the values within Australian culture in, say, 1800 are quite different than the values in Australian culture now.
But have ethics changed over that time?
No, but values change.
So it's an interpretation.
Values set the norms of the culture, and they're a way of enforcing ethics. But ethics transcends them to all cultures, as I said. So values, again, are continuous to time, but that doesn't change in terms of ethics. What ought to be the right thing to do, what is the right thing to do, is determined by moral reasoning.
So people have been thinking about ethics for a long, long time, maybe the longest activity or topic that people have thought about. Do they all agree?
No. And listen, there are degrees in ethical theory.
Mm-hmm.
It is a huge area. And in terms of how we proceed ethically, there's generally two different schools of thought. There's teleology and there's deontology. And if we look at those two different schools of thought in terms of moral reasoning, they come to how we should proceed and how we ought to act differently.
Okay, so run me through these two.
Okay. So first, teleology looks at the good thing, the right thing to do, what's good in the end. And it looks at the process of getting what's good. And the argument with teleology is we proceed into the future by doing the right thing and producing the greatest good. And so the argument is it's not the process, but the product. It's also called consequentialism. And in terms of the utilitarians, Bentham and Mill in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, utilitarianism brought in this branch of ethics by looking at the greatest good for the greatest number. So whatever you do should build the largest degree of happiness. So the end result is what counts.
So it's not about the individual, it's about the greater good.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly right. So if we build a dam for power,
Mm-hmm.
the objective is to build an industrial reservoir for power for the industrialization of a nation,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that we have to move out 200 farmers and a couple of villages doesn't matter.
Because the greater good.
It's what counts.
Okay, so in an engineering term, then you'd say that would depend on your cost function. It would depend on the weights that you applied to electricity and to the happiness of a village.
Absolutely. And so it becomes a case of measuring market and non-market variables.
Okay.
But the greatest good for the greatest number is often the argument you see in a lot of mega projects. That, yeah, we know we have to affect you here, and we know this community is getting impacted, but for the greater number, it's important.
Tell me about the other branch.
The other branch really looks at the process. Deontology, and deontology is a whole area of thought, starting with Kant and moving forward right through to Rawls, that looks at the process. And the argument is that the process and the good are separated. So what is good is separate from the correctness of the process.
It's how you get there.
Correct.
Okay.
So the argument is in fact, how we do it is critical. And that moral guidance as to how we do it makes the difference.
Give me an example.
So, in terms of public participation, the argument is, for example, any government would actually, when they have a large project in their mind, go ahead and do it in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But now we have a process by which to inform the public, to integrate the public, to make decisions as to whether this is the best path to go. And more people are involved in the decision-making process, and as a result, public participation and stakeholder participation has bloomed as a result of this. But the key with this branch, deontology, John Rawls is probably the most well-known philosopher of the 20th century, really looked at a theory of justice. And the argument was, what counts here is justice for the individual. And we base our decisions on what's right for the individual and not to harm the individual.
Okay, so one branch then is the greater good, however we might define that.
Yeah.
Other branch is what's best for the individual.
Absolutely.
So I can pick and choose. No one approach to ethics is better than the other.
Correct. And you can justify it accordingly. For example, in consequentialism, when you look at positive discrimination, in other words, preferential hiring of, say, First Nations or Aboriginal people over top of other applicants, or the hiring of women over top of men, in preference to men. Now, the argument is that positive discrimination is justified in a consequentialist argument, in that there has been problems in the past with respect to how we've treated women and how we've hired. We can rectify that in the present by specifically focusing on hiring them and violating the principle of justice. But the end result is that we'll have 50% women in the workplace.
Yeah.
You with me? So that's a consequentialist argument. Now, a deontologist would take offense to that, because you're violating fairness. And so a consequentialist perspective then has the end result in mind, and again, the greater good in mind. So you can argue from both sides.
So Doug, given all of that, how do I put ethical thinking into practice?
There's no formula, but there is a fundamental kind of basis for all moral codes.
Okay.
It hinges around, again, the individual and the rights of the individual. First, there's the construct of autonomy, the right of the individual to make their own choice and not to violate that. Secondly, there's the construct of maleficence, to do no harm.
Okay.
And it's the ethical code that surrounds doctors. It's formed around non-maleficence. Then there's beneficence, which is to help, to aid. Lastly, there's this notion of justice, and that's Rawls' approach. You must have fairness. The fairness principle is critical.
Is fairness an absolute concept?
Yes, it is. And it can be weighed. If you look at utilitarian theory and Pareto economics, they lay fairness in that construct in terms of what is fair and what isn't, and how do we determine fairness. Yeah, so it translates, much of this ethical theory translates directly into economic and economic theory and utilitarian theory. So it's fascinating how it's all brought in and through it in terms of how we see the world and how we evaluate the world.
So it's not just some abstract notion, it can be put into practice, and it underpins really important things in our society.
Absolutely. There's nothing more applied than a good ethical theory.